There is a region of the world where a name can travel further than a passport ever could. Where a single word, passed from father to son for over 1,000 years, can carry a tribe, a trade route, a kingdom that no longer exists on any modern map. For generations, the story of Arab ancestry felt settled. A desert homeland. A shared language. A lineage traced proudly back through tribal genealogies that stretch, in some families, all the way to pre-Islamic Arabia. It was a narrative built on memory, on oral record, on names recited like scripture. Then genetics arrived, and the picture did not simply confirm the old story. It complicated it, deepened it, and in some places, quietly rewrote it. Because when researchers began comparing Y chromosome lineages, mitochondrial DNA, and broader autosomal ancestry across populations from the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, North Africa, and Iraq, what emerged was not one clean genetic river flowing out of a single desert origin. It was something closer to a delta. Multiple streams. Multiple ancient sources. Some expected. Others, frankly, surprising even to the researchers running the analysis. This is the story of 15 surnames, the ancient kingdoms and trade empires they quietly encode, and what the genome may, and may not, confirm about the deep ancestry behind them. To understand why the DNA findings mattered, you first have to understand what was believed before. The traditional model of Arab ancestry centers on the Arabian Peninsula as a genetic and cultural cradle, home to tribal confederations whose genealogies were meticulously preserved through oral tradition long before written record became common. Historians and genealogists trusted these tribal lineages, known as nasab, as a reliable map of descent, sometimes reaching back dozens of generations. This made sense. Desert environments preserve social memory with remarkable precision, partly because tribal identity determined alliance, marriage, and survival. A name was not decoration. It was infrastructure. But there was a friction point archaeologists and linguists noticed early, long before genetic testing entered the conversation. Arabia was never truly isolated. It sat at the crossroads of 3 continents, adjacent to Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Horn of Africa, and the Indian Ocean trade world. Incense routes, pilgrimage roads, and maritime trade networks moved people, not just goods, for thousands of years before Islam and for centuries afterward. If the peninsula was a closed genetic cradle, why did so much of its material culture, pottery styles, script fragments, even certain agricultural techniques, show clear outside influence stretching back into antiquity? That was the first crack. Well, explainable. Trade does not always mean intermarriage, some argued. Then the DNA analysis widened it considerably. Studies using Y chromosome haplogroups, which trace direct paternal lines almost unchanged across centuries, along with mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line, began comparing modern Arab populations to ancient and modern samples from the surrounding regions. What they found was not a single dominant ancestral signal. Instead, researchers identified several distinct ancestral components layered across the population, some tracing to ancient Near Eastern farming populations, others linked to deeper Arabian Peninsula lineages, and still others showing detectable contribution from the Horn of Africa, the Fertile Crescent, and in some coastal and southern populations, South Asia. A legacy most researchers attribute to the long history of Indian Ocean trade and, in some documented cases, historical migration and forced displacement. If stories like this interest you, subscribe, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most people realize. That did not collapse the tribal narrative. It widened it. The DNA was not accusing the old genealogies of being false. It was suggesting that beneath the recorded tribal lineages sat older, deeper, and more varied ancestral layers than any single oral tradition could fully capture. Researchers now generally describe 3 explanatory frameworks for what the data shows, and importantly, none of them cancels out the others. They appear to operate together. The first is deep founder ancestry. Genetic evidence suggests populations in the Arabian Peninsula carry signatures from very ancient migrations, some tracing back tens of thousands of years, tied to the earliest human movements out of Africa through the region long before any historical Arab identity existed. The second is long-term regional admixture. Centuries of trade, pilgrimage and marriage across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Horn of Africa produced gradual, ongoing genetic exchange, not a single mixing event, but a slow accumulation across dozens of generations. The third, and the one that surprised researchers most in coastal and southern Arabian samples, is a distinguishable Indian Ocean signal, linked to centuries of maritime trade connecting Arabian ports to East Africa, Persia, and South Asia, a connection oral traditions sometimes acknowledged in vague terms, but which genetics rendered precise and undeniable. The landmark moment came when broader whole genome studies, using far larger sample sizes and more refined ancestry panels than earlier limited surveys, began cross-referencing modern Arab populations with ancient DNA recovered from Bronze Age sites across the Fertile Crescent. The comparison revealed something researchers had suspected but could not previously confirm at this resolution. Modern Arabian Peninsula populations retain a genetic continuity with extremely ancient regional inhabitants stretching back thousands of years, even while carrying clear evidence of repeated, layered admixture from surrounding regions over that same span of time. Not a contradiction. A layered inheritance, deep and evolving at once. And then came the twist that reframed the entire story for many families researching their own surnames. Certain tribal and clan names, long associated exclusively with specific peninsula regions, showed genetic signals connecting them not only to nearby Levantine or Mesopotamian populations as expected, but in some documented lineages, to ancestral components associated with the Horn of Africa and, more rarely, subcontinental South Asia. Not the region genealogists expected. Not even the direction most family historians had assumed. The surprise was not that mixing occurred. Trade routes practically guaranteed that. The surprise was how deep, how old, and how geographically wide some of these signals turned out to be, embedded not as a recent event, but as a persistent thread running through many generations. Consider the name Al-Hijazi, tied to the Hijaz region along the Red Sea coast, historically one of the most trafficked pilgrimage and trade corridors on Earth. Or Al-Sharqi, meaning of the East, a geographic marker that in some family lines correlates with detectable ancestral ties reaching toward Persia and the Gulf. Names like Al-Baghdadi and Al-Halabi, tied respectively to Baghdad and Aleppo, encode urban Mesopotamian and Levantine ancestry, regions with some of the deepest continuous human settlement on the planet, where genetic layering runs extraordinarily deep. Al-Yamani, denoting Yemeni origin, connects to a region researchers increasingly view as a critical genetic bridge between the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, given Yemen's proximity across the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Occupational and tribal names carry their own weight. Al-Najjar, meaning carpenter, and Al-Haddad, meaning blacksmith, reflect the same pattern seen across nearly every ancient civilization, surnames anchored not in blood alone but in craft and trade, passed down through families who held that role for generations. Names like Al-Qurashi, tied to the historically significant Quraysh tribe of Mecca, and Al-Ansari, referring to the helpers of Medina in early Islamic history, carry deep tribal and historical weight, though genetic studies caution that tribal surname association does not guarantee an unbroken genetic lineage, since tribal affiliation could historically be acquired through alliance, adoption, or marriage, not only direct descent. And here the caution matters enormously. A surname like Al-Qurashi does not function as a genetic certificate. DNA testing companies analyzing Y chromosome lineages have found that individuals carrying historically significant tribal names sometimes show genetic ancestry consistent with the expected regional lineage, and sometimes do not, a reminder that surnames are cultural and historical artifacts first, encoding language, geography, and social memory, not a guaranteed biological record. What the science does responsibly suggest is a picture more intricate than either the purely tribal narrative or a purely genetic one could offer alone. Human ancestry across the Arabian Peninsula and the wider Arab world does not move in a single clean line from an isolated desert cradle. It moves the way trade winds moved, the way pilgrimage roads moved, the way merchant ships moved across the Indian Ocean for over 1,000 years, carrying not just goods and language, but people, generation after generation, until distinct threads gradually became inseparable from one another. Picture the landscape itself for a moment. Vast stretches of amber sand giving way, at the coast, to a turquoise sea churned by monsoon winds that once carried dhows laden with frankincense, textiles, and travelers between Arabia, East Africa, and India. Inland, ancient wells mark where caravans stopped for centuries, where a Bedouin family's name might have been recorded by a scribe in Damascus, or whispered into a genealogy in Najd, or carried by a trader who settled in Zanzibar and never returned. Every well, every port, every caravan stop is a place where genetic and cultural lines quietly crossed. That is the desert kingdom beneath the desert kingdom we think we know. None of this diminishes tribal identity or the extraordinary discipline of oral genealogical tradition, which preserved real historical memory across an astonishing span of time. What the genome adds is not a correction, but an expansion, a deeper archive underneath the spoken one, confirming ancient continuity in some places and revealing unexpected connections in others. If one of these 15 surnames, or something close to it, sits in your family history, it does not hand you a verified, unbroken genetic chain back to a specific ancient king or tribe. But it does hand you a thread, woven from language, geography, and memory, connecting you to a region that has never truly been isolated, no matter how the old story simplified it. Somewhere between the certainty of inherited genealogy and the caution of modern genetics lies a more honest version of the past. Not one kingdom. Not one bloodline. A vast, ancient network of movement and memory, still legible today in something as ordinary and as extraordinary as the name your family has carried for 1,000 years. If a name here surprised you, or if there's a population whose hidden ancestry you'd like uncovered next, say so in the comments. The map of who we are was never finished. It was only ever waiting for the next name to reveal what history had quietly preserved all along.